will be using the Zoom interpretation feature, but it's not turned on yet. Kelly will make announcements. Kelly will speak in English. Then we will have Mandarin interpretation. Then we will have Korean interpretation. Interpreters, please interpret consecutively until the interpretation feature is turned on. Thank you.
First of all, we would like to thank everyone who submitted their questions. We have collected more than 100 questions regarding special education and disability services. We've grouped similar questions together and we'll try to get as many answers as possible during this meeting. Please note that the presenters are unable to take your questions during this session. However, we have a chat room function available for all the attendees. So as the panel presenters share their insights, please share your feedback and questions with us there. We will share the conversation with the panelists after the event. That's all the housekeeping we have. Now I would like to pass the mic to Dr. Bae. She is the Executive Director here at CIDA, and she's going to kick off the meeting. Dr. Bae, take it away.
Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce New York State Senator Mr. John C. Liu for his opening remarks.
I think I'm on now. Thank you very much, Dr. Bae, for the introduction and for opening up this very important conference. I remember last year's conference, which was so well attended. In fact, there was not enough room for everybody to sit in. And it just goes to show how engaged the community is, especially the Korean-speaking and the Chinese-speaking communities when it comes to inclusion. And that's exactly what CIDA is about. It's about inclusion. It's about developing the community. And so I'm very proud to co-host this important event with you, Dr. Bae, and the rest of your team, including Kelly and all the other wonderful people. 2020 it's a year that we'll never forget. It's been such a difficult year on so many levels, from the tragedies and the lost ones, the family and loved ones lost to COVID-19, to the incredible economic challenges that it has introduced, to the huge social upheavals all throughout this country and right here in New York. It's been a year that nobody could have imagined in advance. And among the most affected people in this coronavirus pandemic have been people with special needs, especially if you look at what's happening in the schools. In March, we went to remote learning, which had some very mixed results. Some of it very challenging for families and students who didn't even have broadband access, much less the devices that were necessary. And the remote learning, you know, it worked for some students, and it did not work for a lot of students. Among the students that suffered the most and really were not able to continue progress through remote learning were those special needs students, those who are on IEPs with the Department of Education. And this is happening not only in the city of New York, but all throughout New York State. So this kind of conference and the topic could not be more timely. I know that you have great representatives from the State Education Department, as well as the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. They're here to answer as many questions as possible. I know we've already got so many questions in the chat box, as well as the questions that Dr. Bae and her team have already collected beforehand. I think the focus today, and the reason why I'm so proud to co-host this, is to continue to keep the doors open and to encourage family members, parents, as well as the public at large, to understand that we have many people among our loved ones, and perhaps we don't have anybody in our family yet affected, but at some point somebody will be. And so we have to learn that you know, CIDA's motto is disability, making disability a possibility. And there is so much potential that has been untapped That's exactly what CIDA is trying to do. That is exactly what the parents involved in this organization and the community activists are trying to do. We're trying to include people. And when we include people, especially those with developmental disabilities, we can truly progress even more so as a community. So I could continue to talk about this topic for hours at length. I've discussed this particular conference with my colleagues in the New York State Senate, and they give it their full support as well. And so, Dr. Bay, I turn it back to you, or perhaps Kelly. And I know we're going to have great presentations. I also look forward to the questions and the answers thereof. Thank you so much, and welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Okay. So I would like to introduce at this point the Dr. Yunju Lee. So Dr. Yunju Lee is a professor of Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and she's joining from Seoul, Korea right now. And she has been the symbol of self-determination and model for all our families who have children with a disability. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Yunju Lee. She's also herself is a person with a disability, and she's going to talk very briefly about our intention and what is important for our families who are affected by the disabilities. Dr. Yunju Lee.
Hi, Dr. Bay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us at this really important conference. I just want to point out a few things before we discuss this important issue. As Dr. Bay mentioned in the beginning, this is the year, 30 years after ADA has signed American with a Disability Act. So that legislation, the intent of the law is to provide access and equity for people with a disability. To simply put, you see ramp on the building, closed captioning when we watch TV. Those are the things that I brought out of the law. But as you know, as a person, people with a disability and families with disability, that's not it. It's just little things out of this big iceberg. And we know the majority of disabled people have struggled to find a job or housing. And what does it mean to live as in a society, in a truly equitable environment? So a lot of ways to think about, right? Sometimes when I think about it during this time of the pandemic, it's just headache. So as I think about the opening mark, I cannot have but mention the hot topic of this day, anti-racism. What does it mean to create social justice that where racism doesn't exist? So as we talk about racism, the issue around disability rights is like way in the background, you know. We gotta talk about racial justice. But as I think about it, how is it really different? Is it really two separate issues? I was fortunate that 2 days ago, I attended a conference for teachers, and the main speaker talked about racism. And these are the 2 points that she pointed out. She said, racism is systematic and invisible. I'm sure a lot of families have children with a disability experience systematic and invisible challenges in every aspect of our society. You start going to the right school is enough, but it is beyond that. After grades, there is a job issue, employment issue, housing issue. So it is a systematic sometimes. And another point is that the main speaker at the conference pointed out that racial equity is possible, but we need a robust and systematic solution. So I was like, when we think about getting right for the people with a disability, we need an organization like CIDA, where people with a disability and family of disability come together and really boost our perspective so that we ask for and articulate the urgent need for robust and systematic solutions. So, as one of the participants in the conference, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of expertise at the panelists so that we can really make a small step each day to bring systematic changes for people with disability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your wonderful words. I think to your point, we're having this policy town hall meeting to be able to make that systematic change. You're, true inspiration to all of us in so many ways. Thank you. So as Dr. Bay introduced earlier, we have Ms. Joanne Lacrosse from New York State Education Department and Mr. Timothy Elliott from OPWDD. Ms. Lacrosse will answer questions regarding special education and remote learning. Mr. Elliott will address questions regarding housing and transition issues today. We're going to dive into the questions regarding special education first with the Ms. Lacrosse, who is the Director of Special Education Services at the New York State Education Department. Welcome, Ms. Lacrosse. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. I'm excited to be part of this.
We have received an overwhelming number of great questions, and I would like to get as many answers as we can. So we're going to dive right into the questions, if that's okay with you.
Perfect.
All right. Let me get the questions. So the first question, I think this is a question that we received probably the most, is ensuring special education services for students with disability and quality control. The federal government has issued several guidance to the state education agencies regarding what can and cannot be waived during the pandemic period. However, we're seeing some school districts have not complied with the proper services as the IEP stated during the pandemic. In some cases, the school districts have not been providing related services at all for a month, and as you can guess, the parents are frustrated, and it is expected that many parents will keep their children at home or participate in sort of a hybrid model of learning during this fall. So families are really curious how the New York State Department of Education will ensure that each district will follow the guidelines from the federal and New York State Education Department and provide appropriate services to our children.
So great question, and lots of components.
Yes.
We know this pandemic really hit New York State especially hard. New York State, and particularly New York City, was really the first real hotspot in the country, and New York City was one of those first districts and really in the nation to close. So districts really had very little time to plan how they would educate students and provide services to students with disabilities in this remote learning environment. The pandemic honestly was not something that schools were prepared for. We've learned a lot over the past several months, and we need to keep learning. And we need to also apply what we're learning so that we can make improvements in the area. I do very much understand your concerns regarding the education of students with disabilities and the provision of special education programs and services. Federal and state law and regulation requires that students with disabilities be provided a free, appropriate public education. And it is important to acknowledge that it's clear that some schools did a much better job at it than others. And we've heard that over and over again. NYSED really has been setting very clear expectations regarding continuity of education, really for all kids, and educating students with disabilities throughout this process. We do have a dedicated website which houses all of our COVID-19 related guidance. And specific to students with disabilities, we've released several guidance documents throughout this pandemic. The first was issued on March 27, 2020, and there were 3 additional supplements since then with a Q&A format. And really the Q&A were based on questions that we got from the field. Questions that we got from parents, from teachers, from students, administrators, providers. The guidance also was developed consistent with the guidance that we received from the federal government. So all of NYSED's resources are located on our main COVID page. And then we also have guidance specific to students with disabilities on our Office of Special Education webpage. So we really do recognize that in these exceptional circumstances, it does affect how education and related services are provided. But FAPE must be provided in a manner consistent with protecting students' health and safety. So consistent with federal guidance, we recognize that schools may not be in the midst of this pandemic when schools are closed or schools may be partially open, not able to provide all the services in the same mode and in the same manner that they typically were provided. This means that the provision of a free, appropriate public education may include, as appropriate, special education and related services through distance instruction, provided virtually, online, via the telephone. Obviously not the most optimal means to do so, but in light of the circumstances, that's the situation. And in these unusual circumstances, again, and consistent with the federal guidance, services for students with disabilities may not always be provided at the same frequency or duration on their IEP, specifically during this pandemic period. However, schools are really expected to implement the IEP to the greatest extent possible for students with disabilities. Until things really get back to normal and kids are in school full time and we're functioning as we were back in January and February. So with schools closed, that does not mean that schools and districts are given a pass on providing special education programs and services. We've really stressed throughout this whole process the importance of communication with parents, to really carefully and thoughtfully consider and discuss with parents what services can and cannot be provided during school closures, and to what extent and to what frequency those services can be provided. We've stressed with schools that it's really important that schools document. They document their discussions with parents, they document the services they offered, they document the services that they provided, and that they continue to progress monitor. They need to be progress monitoring the students' progress, lack of progress, and also any regression that they may have noted in the student during this pandemic period. Also, communication with parents really must be ongoing. We weren't intending for communication to happen once, in the beginning of March, and then that's it. Communication, it's expected that communication is ongoing. Things change. Things change for families. Families along the way have dealt with a lot of illness. They've dealt with a lot of loss throughout this pandemic, as have teachers and providers. So it's been very challenging, really, for all of us. Also, parents, many parents now are working from home when they were typically heading out to a job in the community. So it's a new experience for many. And at the same time, they're trying to support their child in their child's education. And they've got all of these different issues going on at the same time. It's very challenging. So we strongly encourage parents that have concerns about how their child's IEP is being implemented, that they should contact their school administrators, that they should request a committee on special education or a committee on preschool special education meeting to really talk about their concerns. They should also contact our NYSED special education quality assurance regional offices to discuss their specific questions about their child's special education services and obtain information about their rights and their protections under state and federal law and regulation. NYSED has and will continue to monitor to ensure that students with disabilities are receiving their IEP services to the greatest extent possible throughout this pandemic. Our 6 CEQA regional offices throughout the state handle many, many calls all day long from parents with their concerns. And the regional associates will then contact the district and follow up on the concerns expressed by parents and provide technical assistance to the parents to explain to them what they should be doing and ensuring and reviewing the expectations that you really do need to be providing IEP services to the maximum extent possible during this pandemic.
Thank you. You mentioned the changes in frequency and duration. Then I think our parents and educators, the next question are really on the quality. So this question is about the quality assurance of the special education when it comes down to remote learning and services. So during the remote learning period, we have seen an inconsistency. I think you mentioned that in your answer as well. But we saw some inconsistencies in the quality of special education across the state. While some schools have been maintaining quality performance, others have shown failure to communicate with parents and have not really delivered appropriate services. So, Joanne, could you tell us a little bit about what efforts are being made to ensure and improve the quality of special education services, particularly in regards to remote learning and telehealth services this upcoming fall and beyond?
Sure. So NYSED does recognize that in March, schools really had very little time to adjust and adapt to virtual learning when all schools were really closed very suddenly with little forewarning. Teachers honestly didn't have a lot of experience and professional development in regards to providing education in a virtual learning setting. And as I indicated earlier, we've learned a lot over the past several months. As have schools. And whether schools reopen in person, virtually, or some sort of hybrid model come this fall, schools really should now have a better idea of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and how they need to change their practices to ensure increased consistency and success really in this coming year. We just really don't know what school may look like come this fall. On July 16th, NYSED released reopening guidance for schools. And this guidance was informed by 4 virtual regional meetings, regional task force meetings, and also a student forum, which was very, very interesting. Each regional meeting included about 350 experts, parents, stakeholders in health and education fields. And each of these 4 meetings had multiple breakout rooms focused really on different topics related to school opening, transportation, health and safety, education to students with disabilities, all kinds of different topics. I had the opportunity to facilitate a breakout room in each of those 4 sessions. And I have to say those conversations were very, very helpful and insightful. And there was a ton of great recommendations. And I think you'll see the bulk of those recommendations folded into the guidance. Through my participation in this, I learned about some very creative strategies that teachers were using to address the needs of students with disabilities, including students with significant disabilities. With the 4 regional forums, we had over 1,600 parents, students, teachers, administrators, school board members, stakeholders attending, and really provided great feedback upon which, as I said, these plans are based. The guidance really is very student-centered with equity and local flexibility as its core. School reopening plans were due last Friday, and they had to provide a framework to ensure that all students with disabilities continue to receive a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services, really designed to meet their unique needs and to continue to prepare those students for post-school living, learning, and working. These guidelines, to ensure these guidelines are being followed, schools had to submit a survey to NYSED as part of their plan submission. And that survey had to include a web link to their public site where their plan would be publicly posted. But the survey also included a set of mandatory assurances completed by the chief executive officer of a school, particular school, affirming really that the school commits to addressing in each reopening plan all of the mandatory elements outlined in the reopening document. So for example, in NYSED's reopening guidance, schools were directed to consider, particularly for students with significant disabilities, in-person services as a priority for students with high needs, including those students with significant disabilities. Since March, there's been an abundance of resources made available from the United States Department of Education, and there are multiple funded technical assistance centers that have some very wonderful resources. These resources really have provided a lot of great insight and assistance into some of the problems that schools are facing regarding difficulties with online learning and really operating schools within this pandemic period. So our office frequently shares and continues to share these resources via our listserv. And I would encourage individuals to sign up for our listserv. Any publication then that comes out of the Office of Special Education would come to you if you sign up for the listserv. We've also referenced a lot of these national resources in our guidance documents. And I think the important thing to point out is that many of these resources are not only designed to assist school personnel, but also to assist parents and support parents in supporting their child during this pandemic period when learning is occurring remotely. We also have our Office of Special Education Educational Partnership, and we have 14 early childhood and 14 school age family and community engagement centers, or FACE centers as we call them, located across the state. And the FACE centers really are charged with providing technical assistance, professional development that really promotes meaningful family involvement within the educational system, that builds collaborative community relationships, and also provides information and training available about service delivery options from birth through 5 for the early childhood center, and then of course 5 through 21 and for the school age FACE centers. So the FACE centers, as soon as this pandemic hit, we really kind of shifted the work of the FACE centers to provide a variety of supports around COVID-19 related technical assistance resources. And some of the, just to give you an example of some of the supports that we have provided and resources provided by the FACE Center is conducting an individualized education program meeting in a remote setting. How do you do that? Delivery of related services in a remote setting. And they have each of these packages put together so that you're able to access those. One-to-one support available for parents and caregivers, because this has been a really, really challenging time for parents and families to deal with all of the things that's been coming at them. Virtual parent support groups, access to videos and social skills stories, explaining, you know, why did schools close, social distancing, wearing a mask, why, and you know, that kind of information. And also just information and resources on navigating technology for families who can then support their child at home with the technology.
Great. Ms. Joanne Lacrosse, the document that you mentioned, just to clarify, it's the document called Recovering, Rebuilding, and Renewing. Is that the right document?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. You know, I think we all agree that this could be helpful for not just the educators and school districts, but also parents as well. We are going to share the link here to the those of us who are attending this meeting in the chat box so that everybody can check that guidance out. Our understanding is that this document explains the reopening plan really well. We were wondering if the school districts are required or recommended to use or disseminate this guide to inform students and families, as you thought that it was helpful to inform students and families. And we were also wondering if this document could possibly be translated into 13 different languages identified in New York State under the governor's executive order.
Thank you. So that's a great question. Really the fundamental premise of the whole reopening guidance is regular and frequent communication between districts, schools, and parents. And this guidance document certainly should be shared with families and discussed with families. There's a significant emphasis throughout the document on the critical importance of family involvement, of parent engagement. In fact, one of the mandatory reopening plan requirements for students with disabilities is that schools, and we do have a handful of mandatory requirements for schools in regards to educating students with disabilities, one of which, as I said, is parent engagement. Schools reopening plans must address meaningful parent engagement in the parent's preferred language or mode of communication regarding the provision of services to his or her child to meet the requirements of IDEA. Additionally, each school's reopening plan must address how it will document programs and services offered and provided to students with disabilities, as well as communicate with parents in the preferred language or mode of communication. So it's really our very firm position that ensuring clear, ongoing shared communication and collaboration with parents is absolutely critical to ensuring equitable access to special education programs and services, and ensuring continued provision of free, appropriate public education for students. Regarding the translation to different languages, the department had not, to my understanding, yet planned to translate the guidance into other languages. However, we do have a resource for families where they can contact the New York State English Language Learner Parent Hotline, which provides, and I can give you the link for that if you're interested in that, which provides informational services in the 10 most common languages of English language learners in New York State. So if parents have a specific question or require specific information as they prepare for their children's return to school, that would be a great place to start, and it would be in the parents' preferred language. Additionally, NYSED really has communicated that all efforts should be made to make the district reopening plans available in the dominant languages spoken in that school community. So it might not necessarily be our guidance that is translated, but we are strongly encouraging districts to, when they do put together their plan, which many of them have, as they were due last week, that they should be then also translating them into languages, particularly languages dominant in their community.
Fantastic. Thank you for answering that question. So I think you've mentioned several times the importance between the school districts and the families. Could you please give us some outlook on improving the policies at the education department and practices for supporting these families who have the language barriers? We're particularly interested in knowing how the education department is advising schools to support families with language barriers, and especially for remote and hybrid learning.
Sure. So NYSED does require schools to really proactively address inequities, including to the greatest extent feasible, providing support and instruction to all parents and guardians regarding the use of technology in their preferred language and mode of communication. It's also expected that ELLs, English language learners, and English language learners who are also students with disabilities will be provided with the supports necessary to address potential learning loss that may have occurred during 2019 and 20, and also to receive the instructional units of study in the coming school year, 2021. So as part of reopening plans, schools must ensure they're maintaining regular communication, as I said over and over again, with parents and guardians and other family members of English language learners, really to ensure that they're engaged in their children's education during the reopening planning process, and that schools are really providing communication for parents and English language learners in their preferred language of communication. The Commissioner's Regulations, Part 154, requires school districts to provide certain documentation and information to parents in their preferred language and mode of communication, and that includes procuring translation and interpreter services as necessary. Our Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages has posted really a very extensive list of resources on their webpage to enable teachers to really adapt and develop lesson plans and units of study to meet the needs of students who are English language learners, really at all various proficiency levels, and to develop appropriate scaffolds to use in the virtual classroom. And I have a link to that if you would like me to send that as well. It's also It's also important to note that the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages supports 8 regional bilingual educational resource networks, or what we commonly refer to as RBIRNs, that provide technical assistance. And these networks really work in partnership with our Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages staff to provide technical assistance and professional development to districts, really in order to improve instructional practices for English language learners, including English language learners who are our students with disabilities. Schools and school districts have been advised to, in the reopening guidance, to really reach out to the RBIRNs and to use the resources of the RBIRNs and use the resources of the RBIRNs in developing their plans. One of the statewide RBIRN has a list of translation companies and organizations throughout the state, broken down by language, and I can get you that link if that's something you might be interested in. Also, additionally, the language RBIRN hosts a New York State English language learner parent hotline for parents to receive information and to make inquiries about their child's rights and child services. So parents can contact that hotline by phone, by email, by regular mail, in the 10 most common languages spoken by English language learners in New York State. And if you'd like, I could get you that link as well.
Anything you have, we'll take it.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we're a little bit short on time, so I would like to ask two last questions. I think today we are, there is a group of large educators and people who are working for education and department attending this meeting. So we talked a little bit about the quality assurance of the remote learning, and I think we could all agree that the key part of that improvement is providing resources and trainings for teachers. So although remote learning was widely implemented in response to this pandemic, many education scholars are saying that the future of learning will be shifted to distant learning using technology, even without the pandemic. However, we're seeing through this pandemic, we saw that teachers in local school districts are poorly trained to provide learning online. So if you can tell us a little bit about how the department is planning to improve teachers' performance for teaching online, to increase resources and training on technology for teachers.
Okay, I think one of the key areas on July 29, just a few days ago, actually, NYSED was one of 11 awardees in the nation, awarded, and the total award for these 11 awardees was $180 million, awarded by the federal government for a rethinking K through 12 education to better meet the needs of students during the coronavirus disruption. So Congress did set aside 1% of the $30.75 billion allocated in the Education Stabilization Fund through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, as you probably have heard it referred to, for grants to states that really had the highest coronavirus burden. So New York State was notified, as I said, on July 29th, that it received just short of $20 million. And that $20 million will be using that money to provide more than 190,000 teachers and educational leaders with a combined total of 450,000 hours of professional support to implement effective practices around remote and hybrid instruction and learning. And it's estimated that these teachers will have an impact, those who are trained will have an impact around approximately 2 million students in New York State. So NYSED's approach really to the continuity of learning is really founded on two major pillars, a partnership with communities, schools, and educational leaders to close that digital divide, and also steadfast support for New York State educators to get them up to speed as to how to implement remote, distance, or online learning.
That's great to hear. One last question before we move on to OPWDD issues, and this question is not related to COVID, but is instead related to ensuring educational equity and inclusion of students with significant disabilities. Although the Education Department has updated the procedure and guidance for alternative assessment for students with significant disabilities, we're still not clear about the criteria for referring students to New York State alternative assessment. Also, many families are not informed about the alternative assessment and what it means for their children's future and opportunities to enter higher education or job training programs. Does the department have any plans to further clarify the criteria of New York State alternative assessment or to provide the information sharing processes for parents, particularly those with language and cultural differences.
Actually, this has become a very huge focus for our department. We, back in the 2018-19 school year, we really began to focus on this initiative. We developed and released an eligibility criteria for participation in New York State alternate assessment. It's sort of a policy brief to really help districts determine who is and who is not appropriate for alternate assessment. We also, as a companion document to that, developed a participation decision-making checklist so that CPSEs, or CSEs actually, can go through and look at that participation determination checklist, have those conversations with families, really look at that to see, is this child really appropriate for an alternate assessment? What we find is that children tend to get identified for an alternate assessment quite early in their school years. And once you are identified for an alternate assessment, it's tough to make that switch to the general assessments. So it's really important that that decision-making is very carefully calculated and that those documents are used. Our participation rates for students in the alternate assessment are high. And we were notified by the federal government that we're out of compliance with the Every Student Succeeds Act that limits the percentage of students with disabilities, students that a state may assess with an alternate assessment for all students of 1 to 1% or less. And our numbers were higher than that, and they do continue to be higher than that. But as a result of that, we've really put a strong focus on this issue, and we've submitted a plan to the United States Department of Education, which provides information on how we really plan to come into compliance with that 1%. Now, we can't necessarily tell districts that you have to take a child, off an alternate assessment, but we can give them the tools and that they need to make good decisions about whether a student should be taking an alternate assessment or not. So we continue to work with districts to teach them who is and who may not be appropriate for an alternate assessment. And we've developed a tiered intervention system. And the focus really of that tiered intervention system, it's a 3-tiered system. So for districts that exceed a certain percentage beyond the 1%, they're provided what we're calling universal technical assistance, where they're required to submit an assurance that they've completed our Tier 1 activities. And our Tier 1 activities include reviewing our resources related to NYSA eligibility and participating in an alternate assessment. They are required to participate in a webinar and then also take a quiz afterwards to kind of a check of their understanding. And to date, we've had over 5,300 district personnel from across the state involved in this decision-making process have completed this online quiz. So we really is a strong focus there. We also have an additional 2 tiers. Tier 2 and 3 are provided to those districts that have very high rates of participation in the alternate assessment. And we're bringing together targeted supports and skills groups, regional groups, where districts will work together to address some of those issues. We've also implemented a parent notification form of participation in an alternate assessment. We had heard many, many times over that parents had no idea that their child was going to exit from school at age 21 and not have a diploma. So we've instituted where these conversations have to be happening annually, where they have to be happening at the CSE meetings, and parents need to be notified and to discuss what their child needs to do to finish, obtain a a high school diploma. And then also the parent notification form also needs to notify parents that your child is taking an alternate assessment, and as such, your child will not get a regular high school diploma. As I said, many, many parents were just not aware of that. So we do have a very strong focus on the alternate assessment.
Thank you so much, Ms. LaCrosse. I hope these answers provided some clarifications and guidance to parents and educators and advocates who are here today. I see that there was a lot of comments in the chat box. Ms. LaCrosse will share this comments in response to your answers with you after the session. Thank you so much for answering the questions that parents asked.
Okay, sure. And I will follow up with you on some of those websites that you were interested in.
Fantastic. I want to make sure that we have time to ask Mr. Elliott some questions regarding OPWDD as well. So I would like to welcome Mr. Timothy Elliott from OPWDD for the next set of questions. Welcome, Mr. Elliott.
Hello, how you doing? Can you hear me good?
Yes, we can hear you well. There is no question that men and women at OPWDD have been the front line of our fight for the self-determined lives of individuals with disabilities for more than 4 decades. So thank you. But we can, I think, agree that we still experience large gaps in the services and practices, especially for those who are immigrants and have language barriers as well. We would like to address some of the significant issues that have surfaced in the last few years and also during the pandemic as well. So the first question is really regarding the language access. Many families with language barriers have not been well informed about OPWDD services and procedures. Although the number of translated documents in the OPWDD website is increasing significantly, but it is difficult for families to find the information that they need in their primary language. Also, providers, language assistance for meetings and regular communication are still far below expectations. So in the past, several requests of many families with the English language barriers were refused by some of the providers. So families would really like to know if OPWDD plans to change its language access policy. If so, could you please tell us about the changes?
Yes, well, as far as people with limited English proficiency, OPWDD does have policies in place where we can assist the individual with getting services and information in their language. So if we're dealing with somebody that calls us on the phone, we can contact an agency that would help us interpret. As far as August 15th, there will be a new agency that OPWDD will be using. So provider agencies have to
从8月15号开
send
始呢，
in a new
这
updated
个我们会要
form
开始运用一个新的系
to
统。
that new agency. So in the past, they should have been using the agency that we were using before, which was
所以在之
worldwide.
前本来他们是应该要联络这个公司。
There seems to be a gap somewhere between the agency, provider agency, and OPWDD. So if any parent or family encounters that in the future, they should definitely contact OPWDD and let them know. And I will be giving email address to my supervisor, to our office. So if they
所以
do,
呢，可以把这个反馈给我们的我们的 supervisor， 然后他可以从这上面再去跟进。
Hi, Michelle. I'm having some audio issues with the Chinese language.
yeah, I was hearing that too.
Apologies for the technical issues. I'm going to turn the interpretation feature off, and then I'm going to turn it back on. Can you allow me one moment to do that?
Yep. Meanwhile, I'll continue asking questions regarding housing, which is, I think, number one.
집 주거 환경에 대해서 이게 가장 첫 번째로 질문이 많았던
现在呢是一个韩国的这个韩国语频道里面问的。
Interpreters, just hold off on the interpretation for one moment. I'm going to turn the interpretation feature off, and then I'm going to turn it back on. Hold, please.
Apologies for the technical issue. You know, this messiness also is the beauty of having multiple languages in a meeting.
Okay, can we please test the interpretation feature? It should be on now. Attendees should be able to join their channels. Okay, it looks like it's working again. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you for your understanding, everyone. So the housing, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's #1 concern for families who plan to have community living for their children with developmental disabilities. It has already reached the level of crisis, as you know, particularly in New York City, and independent housing is becoming even more difficult for people with disabilities with this pandemic. So, Mr. Elliott, can you please tell us about OPWDD's long-term policy and plan for increasing community housing? And what are sort of the most available or practical options at the moment for the families right now?
Well, one of the things that OPWDD is participating in is called the Integrated Supportive Housing. And right now they've partnered with an agency in Brooklyn called the Block Institute. And I don't know if people are familiar with the former Brooklyn Developmental Center in Brooklyn. They've taken that area and they've converted it into multi-family housing. So they started the first phase this year, the application of moving people into those apartments. This fall, they will have another application round of 67 available apartments. It'll be 1-bedroom and studio apartments that people can apply for. And I think as of 3 o'clock, my supervisor is supposed to email Ms. Bay a list of contacts, including to the Block Institute, where people can call up and apply for the housing that's available in Brooklyn over the Seaview. So they can, even if they're not ready to have their sons or daughter move out on their own, they can still get put on a waiting list because there will be another round of 100 apartments available over the next couple of years. So OPWDD is looking to get more into those type of projects. So right now, like I said, there's 67 apartments that'll be available this fall that people can put in applications for. And then over the next couple of years, there'll be another 100 apartments available in that area.
That sounds very promising. Is there any chance that OPWDD would support, you know, other innovative ideas for community living options developed by community members or family members? I think, you know, recognizing that there is a huge issue and shortage, I think families are coming up with really creative ideas to solve this issue. So if you can shed some light on, you know, whether OPWDD would support those innovative ideas, that would be fantastic.
OPWDD is always open to listening to family members and parents if they have some ideas of ways to support individuals safely, of course, in the community. And so if parents, you know, if there's 1 or 2 parents that have an idea, it'd be better if there's a group of parents that come together. The larger number you have, the more people will listen. So if they come up with a good plan, OPWDD is always open, like I said, as long as it's done in a safe way of supporting people with developmental disabilities in the community. They're moving away more from the certified residences and trying to get people more into the community itself. So any ideas that they can get that will provide that, of course, keep the individual safe, but also keep them connected to the community, because they don't want them to have them isolated. You know, even though you can have your own apartment, you know, they want them in a community where they can have the amenities that everybody else has. So they don't want them to be out in their own apartment, but secluded from the community itself.
Thank you. I think the next question is, I think, you know, past May, although it was a graduation season, I think a lot of parents struggled with the graduation season. But graduating high school for children who are typical is usually is a moment of celebration for many parents and families. However, for many young men and women with developmental disabilities and their families, it is a very scary and frightening step because the future is unclear for them. So during this transition to adulthood, families would like to know about community living options and services available for individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. So perhaps this, you know, is as a question for both Ms. LaCrosse and Mr. Elliott, you know, perhaps an opportunity for collaboration, but if you can share some insights on whether the agency has any plans to improve collaboration with the local schools to engage better with students who are exiting high school.
Well, the schools can always reach out to OPWDD. I know with my office, I've always encouraged the parent coordinators to reach out to us to come and present at the schools. Because we used to have a home buyer program for individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. And I was always available to come out and do presentations. We got a few requests, but not too many from the schools. So we're always available to come out, at least my office is always available to come out and talk about different housing options. Like OPWDD does have a housing subsidy that a person with developmental disabilities can access. You know, if they want to move out into their own apartment, if they want to get a roommate, you know, they would have to be on the lease in order and be 18 years or over to access that housing subsidy. But it's similar to, so it works the same way as Section 8 works. So they will be contributing 30% of their income toward their rent and utilities. And this housing subsidy would help subsidize the rest. But the individual has to be 18 or over, and they have to be on the lease. Or if they're purchasing a home, the family purchasing a home, individual has to be on the deed.
Thank you. Ms. LaCrosse, you know, I asked a lot of questions about special education, but this issue is a little bit related. So in terms of, we're aware that some school districts have dedicated transition coordinator who assist parents with measurable post-secondary outcome goals with IEP. And I think that, you know, OPWDD's involvement with the schools, I think is a little bit related to this. But I understand that the transition coordinators are not really present in all school districts. We were curious if the education department has any plans to mandate transition coordinators in schools.
There are no plans right now to mandate transition coordinators in schools. We do know that when schools have a dedicated transition coordinator, things tend to go a little bit more smoothly. But regardless of whether there's a transition coordinator or not, schools are responsible for ensuring that students with disabilities are provided appropriate transition planning and services to meet their post-secondary goals. So the decision really as to who would take on that responsibility varies from district to district. Sometimes, most often, it's a special education teacher, maybe a guidance counselor, maybe a related service provider. So they are required to ensure, regardless of whether they have a dedicated transition coordinator, that transition activities are carried out. And that decision as to who coordinates those services is really made at the local level.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, you know, we have received a lot of questions regarding care coordination, organization, and quality control preparing services during COVID and things like that. You did let us know that you would share resources with us, so we'll be sure to share those resources with all the attendees today. We're coming to the end of our town hall meeting, so I would like to pass the mic to Dr. Bae so that she can share a few last words.
So thank you again, everyone, Senator John Liu, Mr. Lacrosse, and Mr. Elliott, and all the audience here today. I know that the storm hit hard the other day, and I know that a lot of people still do not have a power. So we hope that we restore power. We'll be able to be connected by next week. But thank you again. Before I go, I would like to recognize our families, children, and professionals who have been incredibly resilient during this difficult time. But I am certain that we will overcome this crisis and create a much more stronger community together. Lastly, please visit our website, cidainfo.com, cidainfo.com. To subscribe our newsletter to learn more about our activities and upcoming events. Again, we were not able to answer and address all the questions with the panel members today because of due to the limited time, and also a lot of the people lost the power in Long Island and the upper side of New York State. So we tried to get the answer from the panelists and other resources as much as possible. And we are also collecting the question from the chat box today. So we'll try to get the answers and resources, and we'll get back to you within a couple of the weeks. So thank you again, and please be safe, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.